Today, we meet to discuss humanitarian diplomacy and the influence of new actors and new technology. Recently, in our web debates, we started to have this focus on new diplomacy. So this means we're looking at the emergence of new actors, new topics. And in this sense, today, we are asking, what are the lessons we can draw from looking at humanitarian diplomacy? And what is the impact of new actors and new technology? To share their perspective and insights, we have two excellent speakers with us. I'm happy to have Ambassador Christopher Lam, Javier Ormeño with us. Ambassador Lam is a former Australian ambassador and is now special advisor to the Australian Red Cross and the IFRC. Mr. Javier Ormeño has been part of the Red Cross movement since 2008 and is currently disaster response and recovery senior officer at the Red Cross in Geneva. So Chris, as you might have guessed, is joining us from Australia, and Javier is joining us from Geneva. Before I go ahead and give the floor to Chris, I would like to encourage you to share your questions, thoughts and comments in the chat window on the left-hand side. Because in the second half of our hour together, we will engage in a Q&A with Chris and Javier. And for that, your comments, your questions will be crucial. So please don't hesitate, please don't hold back. I will be monitoring all the comments, all the questions, and will then relay them to Chris and Javier. Now, however, I would like to hand over to Chris for his introduction to the topic.
Thank you, Katharina, and good evening to everybody. It says me at 11 o'clock at night in Melbourne, and I hope that wherever you are in the world that you're enjoying yourselves and having a good time. And thank you for joining us here to talk about humanitarian diplomacy and the actors and technology. You'll see on the screen, I hope, the definition of humanitarian diplomacy which we are using. It's the definition that was adopted by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in 2009. And although it was done by the International Federation, it's now been accepted very widely around the world by the UN, specialized agencies, other intergovernmental organizations, a lot of NGOs, and even by some governments. And although it's not exactly the same as the definitions that you might have been used to from earlier days, it's one that suits people well. What it does, and I'm going to spend a minute or two on this because it shows who the actors are and how the actors come into play. It's about persuasion. We decided not to talk about advocacy or negotiation or the other things that people often think of when they come across the word diplomacy, but to talk about persuasion. If someone is persuaded to do something, they do it because it becomes something of their own will. It's not something they're doing because they're forced to do it by others. It's something they're doing because they've been persuaded that it's in their best interest to do that thing. But we want these decision makers, and we stress opinion leaders as well, to act at all times in the interests of vulnerable people. We had in mind when the definition was drafted that somebody could wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, as you often do early in the morning, and say to yourselves, vulnerability is what I have to protect. And in working out how to protect vulnerability, we wanted those people to think in terms of full respect for fundamental humanitarian principles. And we used that term, fundamental humanitarian principles, to make it clear to the Red Cross people who undertake these tasks that we're not talking about something which is embedded in the dictionaries of the Red Cross movement. We're not talking about the fundamental principles of the Red Cross movement, of which there are 7. We're talking about the fundamental humanitarian principles as adopted by the United Nations system. The United Nations General Assembly has at first adopted 3 of the principles as principles that had to guide humanitarian work. They were the principles of humanity, impartiality, and neutrality. And then a couple of years later, they added the principle of independence. Those 4 principles all feature in the Red Cross fundamental principles, but there are 3 others which have not been taken by the UN and in fact aren't appropriate to that. So that's what we work with, the definition. And now we have another slide, which I'd like to be able to give you, but I'm not sure that I know how to bring the next slide on. It's there. Thank you, Darwin. These signposts, which are part of the policy, as you can see, were adopted at the same time as the policy or put into the background documentation. And these are the tools that people are expected to find themselves using. There is a responsibility to persuade. If you're a humanitarian organization and you have a charter and you have a function and a mandate, you have a responsibility to perform the actions that you are looking at if they're part of your mandate. It's not something which is optional. If you see distress for the vulnerable and people who are in particular need, you have a responsibility to do what you can to help them past their problems. In doing that persuasion, there are tools that you would need to use, and those tools will vary a little from place to place and from situation to situation. But the kinds of tools we will look at today are those which have to do with the technologies now available. Of course, when you're doing your persuasion, you should focus on what you know best and what you can do. So your own expertise or the expertise of your team is what you should work with. You don't guess out there in the moonlight about what you might be able to do. You work with what you can do well. And in order to get the other things covered that your own expertise doesn't reach to, you engage with the appropriate external partners. They might be partners from within your own general organization, or they might be somebody quite different. They might be a government. They might be an intergovernmental organization. They might be a university and academics, or they might be practitioners working in the same general field as you. So those are the tools that we work with when we talk about humanitarian diplomacy. One of the things that people have thought as they look at what we do with humanitarian diplomacy is that they think we're working on something new, but in fact we're not. Humanitarian diplomacy in its modern form can be traced back, in the Red Cross sense at least, to Henri Dunant, the man who came to the battlefield at Solferino in northern Italy in 1859 and saw the devastation that had been wrought there by the battle between the Austrians on the one hand and the Italians and the French on the other. He moved into action without reference to the nationality of the people who were lying on the battlefield, injured or even dead, and he worked to try to help them. And he wrote a book called The Memoir of Solferino, which was published in 1862. In just 2 years after that book was published, the nations of the world at the time adopted the first of the Red Cross conventions, and with that began the formal march towards international humanitarian law as we understand it now, and through that an understanding of the part that's played by organizations representing communities, in those days the Red Cross Societies. That all changed after the First World War, when the devastation of that war caused people to look again at what needed to be done. And Red Cross societies started to spring up in countries all over the world, and they united to form the League of Red Cross Societies in 1919. That gave birth to the modern NGO movement that we all know well, that we see. And it gave birth to a great deal of study in universities elsewhere. And because the Red Cross movement was based through treaties, it brought governments into play as well. The thing that has happened now, and I'm moving quite quickly, and I apologize for the speed of this, but we don't have a lot of time. The thing that we're looking at now is how the stakeholders are brought together as actors in the field of diplomacy. What we teach people in the humanitarian diplomacy course that we run through the Diplo Foundation is that if you're going to do your diplomacy work, you have to know who you're working for, who you're working with, who you might have to be working against. You have to track them very carefully because you are working, after all, most of the time, in organizations which do not have military power, economic power, and the ability to force results out of those that you're working on. You have to try to bring people to an understanding of what they need to do, and you need to be able to go back to what I said before on the definition and persuade them. So you conduct a stakeholder analysis as best as you can. Who are these people? And not only who do they represent, what are the policies of the government or the institution they represent, who are they personally? What are the kinds of things that might influence them? And it's at that point that people see how government policy or the policy of an institution on one side has to be looked at through the eyes of human beings. Who are these people? What do they like? How do they want to work? And to do that properly, you have to understand the role of protocol, the way people can work with each other through protocol, how you find general behavioral rules that cut across national boundaries, cultural boundaries, linguistic boundaries, and all those other things. The point about working for vulnerable people is that they themselves are also actors, and that's particularly so today. One of the things that introduces a new understanding of actors is the modern world with the technology that we have around us. We have the internet. We're using it right now to talk and to correspond with each other. In order to do that, we use the internet and all the things that is open to us. It's only in very recent years that we have seen the emergence of institutions in the internet like Facebook. Before that, we saw SMS and forms of electronic communication very widely available. There are now all sorts of other communication forms, and ones that I think a lot of us would be using are the voice over internet protocol communications through things like WhatsApp or Viber or Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and all those things. This has meant that there has been an explosion of opportunity for people to take part in diplomatic communication, or in communication which is part of the diplomatic effort. I think the country that I do a lot of work with, because one of my roles is to be the president of the Australia Myanmar Institute. In Myanmar, in 2013, there were 2 million people with access to the internet, out of a population of 60 million in the country. There are now 30 million smartphones in the country. This means that people who just a couple of years ago were completely excluded from political, economic and other communication across the boundaries in the country are now very much part of it all. It means that people who are untrained very often, and with that inexperienced, I think that's a better way of putting it, inexperienced at the kinds of communication that are now available, are now out there and communicating. This means that it's fertile ground for all sorts of difficulties for governments. Governments can't control it, and if you're in a country like Myanmar, governments are used to control, but they don't have that control anymore, and they'll never get it back. It means that evidence, and I can put that in quotes if you like, because sometimes evidence is real evidence, sometimes it's fake evidence, but it's proliferated. And if you look at the current crises in Myanmar, if you're familiar with them, the issue of the Rohingya, for example, there is all sorts of quote-unquote evidence floating around in the internet, giving rise to all sorts of other actions by other people in diplomacy or others. So the arrival of communications technology of types that the world had never seen until just a few years ago is affecting people everywhere in the world. Isabella asked a question, which country am I referring to? Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, is the country. If you heard that okay. So the proliferation of information and the way it gets around so quickly and the way it's picked up by newspapers and other media and run as news means that those of us who grew up in diplomacy, and I did in the Australian Foreign Ministry, grew up in an atmosphere where you would often be the first to know something if you were in the ministry, and you'd prepare a briefing paper for the minister or for senior people about what that situation was, and then the minister would take a decision about what to do, and that would be that. Now, on the other hand, the minister knows through Twitter, before you know from real news, what it is that you're trying to be talking about. And it's very hard to cope with that if you're in traditional diplomacy. So everybody involved in diplomacy has to understand that the rules of the game have changed markedly since the arrival of all this technology. And in the case of humanitarian diplomacy, where your actors include the people on the ground, include the people who are producing this news through Twitter or Instagram or whatever, we all have to understand how that's put together and what's to be done with it once it's there. Stakeholder analysis will tell you something about the people who are producing this news. You need to know who is producing it and for what purpose they might be doing it. Is it for fun? Sometimes it's as simple as that. They're doing things for fun. Is it because they're servicing a political agenda of their own? Sometimes that's true too. But you need to try to know those things. Now, I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to quickly conclude, but we'll come back to some of these other points and questions. One of the things that technology has changed because of the way it's permeated the whole framework of diplomatic communication is accountability. Once upon a time, diplomats had to account for their actions to their bosses, and that was that. Now, humanitarian diplomats and all diplomats have to understand that accountability reaches out to all those stakeholders that you're meant to have analyzed before you start your work. Once upon a time, if you're in an NGO or another type of humanitarian organization, your main accountability route was to your donors. Not anymore. The accountability is directly back to the beneficiaries of your action. And that's a hard thing for people to understand. Now, I would have given you, if we'd had more time, some examples of how this all works in the real world, but I won't now. I'll stop, and Katharina, you might like to invite Javier to take over.
Okay, thank you so much for these insights. I already picked up quite a number of things, fundamental humanitarian principles, the importance of stakeholder analysis, the impact of technology. We already have a couple of questions, but before we get to that, I'd like to give the floor to Javier, who is going to focus us a bit more on one specific case, and if I understood correctly, who's also going to give us the link between humanitarian diplomacy and human rights. So Javier, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you today. I'm not sure if it's today or tonight, wherever you are based. I want to focus on the following. This presentation will link a little bit my research in human rights with the humanitarian diplomacy tools. I will highlight the fact that humanitarian diplomacy tools can be used to elucidate a strategy that is not overtly clear, and also that advocacy actions can be shaped in creative ways. The fact is that I am trying to understand with my research how theater is being used in Peru for advocating for LGBT rights. I got interested in the theater because it's a way in which you can reach masses of people and convince them using this characteristic of a theater of having a body on stage that it's a vicar of the audience emotions. Please let me know if you got me, if you're hearing me well, or if I should slow down. This way, like tapping on emotions, theater facilitates the process of understanding others. In Peru, there is an important tradition of theater that nurtures the two organizations I have identified are using the theater as strategies. The first one is called Presente, or present, and the second one is collective imaginary. I will start calling it CI now on. They both follow different strategies for raising awareness and making incidents in Congress and governmental gender policies. Both have in common the use of theater as a means to reach target people, and in both cases the main characters of the plays they're enacting is a homosexual person or a travesti. Both organizations have relied on an efficient identification of funding sources, usually international government missions and LGBT+ owned business. This is where Chris mentioned to identification of stakeholder analysis. It's very important for advocacy, and other partners such as collectives and activist organizations that usually assist them in building key messages and facilitating discussion panels that have been integrated after the plays. The diplomacy maths is pretty simple. You use a mean that can convey the relevance of LGBT rights and generate allies for improving laws and policies in favor of this minority. Instead of being a direct diplomacy tool, it is a tool for raising awareness and increasing the number of potential allies. LGBT issues become more visible, and topics became public discussions instead of taboo. The first organization, Crescent mission statement, has a strong emphasis on advocacy for protection of LGBT rights through changing the law, while Collective CI, or Collective Imaginary, has a generic art group mission statement, but its work is focused mainly on LGBT rights. The aims and target people of both groups are supplementary. In the case of a first group, Presente, a gay person, actor, and it's a well-known person usually, an actor, a journalist, a politician, would do some travesty on stage and will tell his or her story. These monologues, which are usually on the comic side, are aimed to the bigger audience. The comedy element minimizes affecting sensitivities, and those hard subjects as violence, difficulties in relationships, are usually mentioned in a funny way that facilitates the public to identify LGBT issues with their own issues and see them close to each other. Once this has happened, the public can become, or the audience can become, an ally for the fight of the rights of LGBT people. On the contrary, Collective Imaginary performs LGBT problems in a very straightforward way. Most of the subjects, family rejection, dealing with multiple partners, living with HIV, rape, for instance, usually move emotions of LGBT people attending this place, but can hurt non-LGBT people's sensitivity. This, in the case, they managed to figure out the issues depicted. It would seem counterintuitive to disrupt possible allies among non-LGBT people, members of the public, but the plays aim LGBT people to acknowledge their issues, and in some cases come out with these issues or feel empowered. I think that this complementarity between these two organizations does well to enlarge the numbers of allies fighting for LGBT rights, and is a token of creative ways in which you can use some advocacy or diplomacy tools. So now I want to focus. I want to mention that some common issues to these groups, like one has identified, like this identification of or stakeholder analysis is crucial for any diplomacy action or advocacy action, because it allows people to first identify who you are and who are you going to talk to. And we see in these two groups different aims, like a big objective, common objective, but different public, target public. Then both of these groups, adding up to what Chris was mentioning, they rely heavily on the use of social media. In the case of Presente, the first group, which is high-profile gay people, they rely on social media, but they use like the regular TV shows and regular radio shows to highlight that there is an event that's going to happen and gather audience. Most of the time, the theater is fully booked for the whole season without even them making a lot of propaganda. On the other hand, this group called Collective Imaginary, which is smaller and lacks a lot of resources, relies much more on social media for reaching out the public, and also they get most of functions most of the days of performance are fully booked usually. So that's more or less it, if I don't want to run on more time.
Thank you, Javi. I think some of the issues we definitely can come back to. So thank you to both of our presenters who kind of framed the debate for us and already raised many important questions. Before I come in with some of my own observations, I think it is very important to give, so to speak, the floor to one of the questions and comments that has come up in the chat very early on. And I think this is an important question that probably many of us will have. I noticed in Chris' presentation, we were speaking about fundamental humanitarian principles. And the following question by Professor Yolanda Spies is building on that. So she writes, to what extent has humanitarian diplomacy become burdened by the contentious and bitter debate around humanitarian intervention? So, for example, the problem that humanitarian diplomacy can be a Trojan horse when it is abused by powerful actors, states or groups of states to mask their interest-driven diplomacy. And she uses the example of the situation in Syria and also the intervention in Libya in 2011. And in a similar vein, Ambassador Kishan Rana very much agrees with this point and says some of the earlier actions in Libya have served as a setback to humanitarian actions. So I think I would like to pose this kind of question, this kind of comment to both of you. Do we have a generally agreed set of fundamental humanitarian principles? And to what extent does national interest come in when we speak about humanitarian interventions? And what about these very critical and very difficult to analyze cases, Syria and Libya, that have been mentioned? What would be your response from your perspective as practitioners to these kind of concerns?
Perhaps I could start and say that the fundamental humanitarian principles I mentioned when talking, they are the first four of the fundamental principles of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, all of which have been endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly for the United Nations humanitarian world. So the specialized agencies, OCHA, and the organizations which have anything to do with humanitarian work have to abide by the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence to the extent that that's possible. There is a ranking of these principles, and there are books about these which I'm sure many of those present in the room will know about. But these principles are quite clear what those four fundamental humanitarian principles are. There are derivatives of them that can be put to work from time to time, but the ranking of them tells you what the order of these things is. Now, as to the questions from Yolanda, the extent to which HD, if I can use that abbreviation, has become burdened by contentious and bitter debate around humanitarian intervention. At the very beginning of these fundamental principles, at the Battle of Solferino in 1859, you had at the time what were the most contentious and bitter debates in Europe at that time. And that's where all this started. There's nothing particularly new about contentious and bitter debate in the humanitarian world. I know that what we're looking at now in Syria and what we have seen in Libya, which hasn't finished, is a terrible state of affairs for the world to witness. But we are witnessing it now almost as participants because of the news in front of us all the time, because of social media, electronic media, the internet, and all that goes with it. I remember once upon a time seeing a film, a very good film, a long time ago, and I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's called Black and White in Africa, and it's about the situation in Cameroon when the First World War broke out, and the Germans, the French, and the British colonists who were there didn't even know that the war had started until 3 months after it did start. There they were sitting around their club drinking gin together. They got the mail boat came in, and they learned from the mail boat that they were all at war. And the story went from there. That doesn't happen anymore. We know the very second that something happens because of what goes on. So I wouldn't say that humanitarian diplomacy has become burdened. I think it has always been burdened by humanitarian action, or by non-humanitarian action between states and the powerful actors. That goes to the point that was brought by Kishan Rana. He says some of the earlier actions in Libya have served as a setback to humanitarian actions, and that's true, but it's not a setback to humanitarian diplomacy. humanitarian diplomacy's work is to try to rescue the humanitarian action, so that despite the terrible things that happen out there in the battlefield or between politicians, humanitarian action can continue to take place. And there are some very good examples in Syria of humanitarian action continuing to take place. In Libya right now, where the situation is far from any good, it is still producing people who are very keen to try to find the way forward through humanitarian diplomacy to bring their country back onto the straight and narrow. One of the people who's doing our humanitarian diplomacy course right now is from Libya. Another one is from Syria. They're doing the course through the internet that we're using now from places which are under threat. Even in one case, we had the Syrian participant doing the course with bombs outside. But he was still doing it because he felt that he had to understand what these responsibilities to persuade meant, so that he could work with other people in Syria committed to try to bring their country back. And I think that we have a good case to go forward. But it's not to be mixed up with humanitarian action. That's a different thing. Humanitarian diplomacy can produce humanitarian action, but it is not itself humanitarian action. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Javier, would you...
If I can add something to what Chris has just said, is that certainly now we live in a world where we have immediate access to information or to data. What this can complicate, or this can cause complications for humanitarian diplomacy, is basically having reliable data, because we have one set of data that is managed by most of people that can reach a lot of population, and that data may not be true. That can be like fake news, as there is this word. And what complicates humanitarian action, in a sense, is trying to continue having access to the most accurate information possible on the one hand, and also I don't think this is a challenge, having the news or having more information more rapidly, but actually it pushes everyone into better accountability. So rather than being a difficulty, I think it's a good thing that there is more information out there. So all actors, including humanitarian diplomacy actors, are compelled to having more better accountability to all the parties. That said, I think with Chris that part of what humanitarian diplomacy does is safe humanitarian action, because our job is to continue facilitating access, and that's what I can add.
Thank you so much. I think that was a very very comprehensive response to this question, what about national interest? And it's a question we often also get, for example, in the development diplomacy course we're currently running. So it is a question that is on the back of people's minds quite a bit. There's an interesting comment kind of on that note from Professor Yolanda Spies, just to read it. She says, as diplomats, we do not all agree on norms, but we all have an inner compass that tells us what is right. The challenge is to do what is right, and that includes advising our governments, building solidarity among our peers, and not just to give up. So in that sense, diplomacy is actually a huge responsibility. I have another question that I would like to bring into the debate, and again, we're kind of still staying with the state as an actor in humanitarian diplomacy. And that question was posed by Ambassador Stefano Baldi. He basically asks, when we talk about humanitarian diplomacy, don't you think that the principle of solidarity among countries is also essential for any successful humanitarian diplomatic action? And he clarifies, he's saying, in particular, he has in mind the attitude of countries or governments, for example, in the case of refugees, when it comes to accepting migrants in their country. And obviously there's a strong discussion in Europe at the moment. So what is your take on this need for solidarity among countries in order for humanitarian diplomacy to flourish? And maybe also let's start with Ambassador Lam.
Okay, thank you. I'd say to Stefano, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again very much, my friend. It's a long time since we saw each other. But we, again, as I said with the last question, the one from Yolanda, we're not so much talking about the actions of governments with humanitarian diplomacy. We're talking about the people who are trying to get the governments to do things. And so it's a matter of how for a small country, say, to motivate a large country to do something. How does a small Pacific Island country motivate Australia to do something about climate change? The small Pacific country doesn't have the power at all to get the Australians to do something, so they have to turn to other types of action. In the case of migration, and I was going to mention this as an example if I'd had enough time, because it's an example of humanitarian diplomacy that can be exercised at all of the levels at which diplomacy can be put to work. At the very local level, persuading the people who live in a community that it's safe for them and even good for them to accept refugees and asylum seekers to live among them. We all know of cases, and it's not a European thing, it's all over the world, where a host community resists the arrival of new people, especially if they're a different ethnicity and a different language, religion, culture, etc., to come and live with them. That's at the very local level. At the national level, you can see this developed by governments and political parties, sometimes for their own purposes. At the multilateral level, you can see governments coming together to try to work out how to resolve a refugee crisis or a people movement crisis. Sometimes those motivations that they take to those discussions come from that local level where people are resisting the arrival of new people. So what humanitarian diplomacy does in a case like that is to invoke a form of solidarity among the humanitarian diplomats. And it's not, I'd say to Kishan, an EU or Western thing. It's something which can happen anywhere in the world, and does happen anywhere in the world, as people who know which way their moral compass is pointing, to use that term, and thank you for that, Yolanda. People can follow that moral compass and try to bring these principles, going back to the fundamental humanitarian principles, bring them to work for the benefit of all. And there's where the solidarity comes in among the humanitarian diplomats if they've done their stakeholder analysis properly. Because if they have, they'll know who they can work with to form that solidarity and put it to work. Governments look at what solidarity can do for them regularly. That's how the League of Nations was formed, and it didn't work. That's how the United Nations was formed, and it sometimes does work, but sometimes not. They look for ways of doing things about migration among themselves. And so you can see, if you're thinking of Europe, what's done by the Council of Europe, by the European Union, by the OSCE and those organizations. You can see in Africa what's happened through things like the Kampala Declaration, Kampala Convention on IDPs. There's in Latin America, lots of these things happen through attempts to bring government solidarity to work. But they're all feeble and fragile. You need the support of the people in the countries to make it work properly. And I think it does, by and large. Or, I think if it doesn't work all the time, at least it provides a framework for things to happen in future. And one of the things we teach in our humanitarian diplomacy course, and Javier will remember this and smile about it, there's no such thing as failure. There is such a thing as deferred success, not failure.
Yes. In my own activity, I have experienced this. Like sometimes you have to keep trying or looking at different ways, because of course, governments, they do have their own agendas, and that's more or less different. Like that's the basic difference with like regular diplomacy and humanitarian diplomacies. In one case, you have or like traditional state diplomacy is about advancing the goals of or interests of a certain state, while humanitarian diplomacy, you have to enter in discussion with this big interest to for having better access for humanitarian purposes. And as Chris was mentioning, maybe diplomats engaged into humanitarian diplomacy can tap into that moral compass that every actor has, and knowing who a diplomat can address to achieve the goals of access.
Thank you for these insights. What I would like to do now, also because time is very short, I would like to shift the perspective a bit from this national or international level to the local level, which will especially resonate well with Javier's presentation. I picked up a really interesting quote from Chris's presentation. He said, we need to look at the field through the eyes of human beings. And then in Javier's presentation, he was talking about raising awareness, increasing understanding on the ground, so to speak, through different means with different stakeholders. And what I'm interested in, what are the limits of this, or what are the challenges of developing this understanding? For example, you've done your stakeholder analysis, you know who are the most important players, but then you also need to promote understanding among these players, a kind of a common understanding. So what are the challenges you see, or what are the challenges you encounter in the field in doing this? And Javier, obviously in your case, I would like to hear more about the two cases you mentioned. And maybe in that sense, we could start with you and then go over to Chris.
Regarding these LGBT rights in Peru, Peruvian society is still a highly traditionalist society, and not precisely traditional in the sense of they want to grant human rights to everyone, but there is a lack of empathy towards what is not mainstream. These two groups, I am going to start with Crescent, which is the bigger organization. They work with high-profile people who usually shows up in television. So they already have this fame, and they already have the sympathy of the masses, let's say. So showing that people that it's far away in the TV has some human side allows a general public to feel more interested in the particular issues that affect minority. That's what I can say about this struggle of these two collectives. They have achieved through certain impact in gathering allies for attending marches, for asking for rights. Like in both cases, like both of the plays that I am mentioning, or both of the plays of the groups I'm mentioning, they are carried out before big marches. So it seems that they gather more allies. Yep. Chris, maybe you want to complement, like reaching in the public level of diplomacy?
Well,
or the community level?
Thank you, Javier. I was thinking about what you were saying at the same time as I was contemplating the writings people have put into the chat lines. And I think it's important to stress that a humanitarian diplomat is not the same thing as a government diplomat. A humanitarian diplomat can be anybody at all, and it can be a volunteer, even in the field situation. One of the cases that we have given as an example of that is a case of a person who was working with the Red Crescent Society of Tajikistan at a water and sanitation project in the north of the country when the Minister for Health came there. And this person who was there at this water pump or digging a hole found himself talking to the Minister for Health. And what he had to do was to represent himself and his team to the Minister, to explain what they were doing, and do so in a way that would get the Minister to favour what was being said, and then produce resources to help the project grow and do more. And this person did a wonderful job at that. He'd had a little bit of training, but enough training to understand what that meant. And that was very important. And I think for those who are in the room today who know of the task of a diplomat, this means that you also need to have some understanding of some basic tools. One of them is protocol. So we provide to the people who do our course the protocol handbook produced by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in my time there, so that people who are working in project situations or in non-government organizations can understand what sort of things might be required at the local level to be able to handle the relationship that that local level person might have to have with a minister or a very fancy foreign visitor who's come to the project site. And it enables them to get by. Some of the people, and I'm sure we've all had experience of this in our lives, some of the people who come to see what's happening at a project come with all their bells and whistles on, accompanied by the media, by television cameras, by all sorts of fancy things that are going to make the minister or the visitor look good back home. You can't afford to get it wrong when a person like that comes. If you get it wrong, you'll be just drifted off. If you get it right, you'll get money, support, resources, and assistance for the future of your project. And that's the case anywhere in the world. There's nothing particularly Western about that at all. So the humanitarian diplomat is somebody who can be anywhere. And Kishan, you've asked, do we not add to confusion if we treat NGO reps as humanitarian diplomats? No, we don't. We don't add to confusion at all. What we do, in fact, is to use the word diplomat as it once meant, as it was once meant to be used. A diplomat is a representative, not necessarily a state representative. It became a state representative in Western terms in about the 17th or 18th century after Christ. But it doesn't have to be called, it doesn't have to be restricted to a state representative now. We just have to understand what we're talking about. And as I said in the very beginning, governments are now starting to use the term humanitarian diplomat as we understand it in the course we teach. We have, at the moment, in the course that's running right now, I think we have 3 or 5 people from governments who are placed in our course to understand what we're doing. And they're using the course for their own purposes, not just as a foreign ministry diplomat in the traditional sense, but for people from the aid agency of their country, from the Ministry of International Cooperation, whatever it might be called, those people as well. Because governments who used to do their work through their narrow band of diplomats in a treaty-making foreign policy sense now have contact with each other at all sorts of levels. The average embassy of a decent-sized country might have people from half a dozen different government departments in that embassy, many of them with no training in what we would regard as traditional diplomacy. So no, I don't think there's a confusion at it. I think there is something that has to be explained, but I don't think it needs to be confusing. But I do go back to what I said about Tajikistan at the local level, because I think it's very important to understand that people at the local level, and the Tajikistan example gives you that, often have to act in just the same way and with the same objectives and purposes as the traditional state diplomats in capitals.
May I add that diplomacy is not only carried out with representatives of government or state agents, it can be carried out among communities. I am going to mention one of the cases of reconstruction in Peru. We were trying to build, reconstruct some houses, but there was no land tenure or there was no green land when we could do that. And it was an empowered community leader who identifying who had available land, that advocated for that landowner to donate some land for the reconstruction to be carried out. The same thing happens also in this reconstruction process of having better prices for the tools and materials, construction materials that we were needing for our reconstruction mission. Like sometimes having access to local suppliers is something that has to be carried out whether by volunteers or by community leaders of an affected community, to facilitate more efficient use of resources. And with that more efficient use of resources is, I mean, having better prices. Like if you have a contractor that has to bring I don't know, wood planks from the city to a very distant province, and you can facilitate for that contractor to do it, maybe earning some money but on a lower fee than his usual fare, then you are doing humanitarian diplomacy. You are improving the quality of life of people, or you are able to do more with the same resources that you otherwise would be spending.
Thank you, Chris and Javier. This is an excellent note to almost end our discussion on, because what we just addressed, this difference between traditional diplomats and so-called new diplomats, goes exactly to the core of the debate we've been having over the last couple of weeks about this distinction, whether this distinction is still necessary and needed. So that adds to our discussion in larger sense as well, which is really great. We only have about 5 minutes left. So what I would like to ask you to do is, maybe in a kind of final statement, what is the key challenge for the future of humanitarian diplomacy? Or alternatively, what is your key hope for the future of humanitarian diplomacy as practitioners who have been in the field and involved in a number of scenarios? So what is your key hope, or what do you see as the key challenge facing humanitarian diplomacy in the near as well as far future? Starting perhaps with Javier, if that would be okay.
For me, one of my hopes for humanitarian diplomacy, as we're using and teaching in the course, is to disseminate these tools. I believe that they are great not only for highly trained people, but with people with less experience and with less, let's say, university degrees. Putting these tools in a very simple way helps community leaders, or would help more community leaders, to reach and achieve the goals of their own community and improve not only humanitarian access, but access to their basic human right entitlements. Yeah, that would be it.
Okay, if I look at the challenges of the future, I start as usual in the past, and I think about what happened when governments drafted the United Nations Millennium Development Goals for the period between 2000 and 2015. That was one of the first clear efforts by the United Nations community to invest community level people, community groups, with some sort of responsibility, or create some form of accountability from governments back to the population. It didn't work very well, and one of the difficulties that I saw from a country like Australia was that governments often found it easy to regard the MDGs as something which had to do with development cooperation. When the Sustainable Development Goals were done, they were much stronger in their relationship with governments to their people. And the obligation on governments to consult with people is stronger there. I don't think it's going to be served very well, but I think one of the challenges for humanitarian diplomacy and governments in the future is to equip themselves to handle much closer working together in terms of standing alongside each other to achieve humanitarian goals. There are some human rights treaties where governments are supposed to get the views of non-government organizations and communities before they produce their reports to the international system, but they don't work very well yet. And I think humanitarian diplomacy will be used more and more in the years ahead to integrate the work of communities and the public with the work of governments. Governments will resist this, and the humanitarian diplomats will have to work very hard to try to maintain the empowerment of their own people. But if that works and is done well, at all levels mentioned before, including the local level, we have a prospect of looking at a rather different world 25 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for these hopes as well as key challenges for humanitarian diplomacy in the future. I can only agree. So let me just say thank you to our two excellent speakers, Ambassador Christopher Lamb and Mr. Javier Armenio, for a very interesting debate that challenged us on many levels, on the personal, the conceptual, as well as very practical in terms of humanitarian diplomacy. So thank you to the two of you. I really enjoyed the debate. I would like to invite you to join us for our next debate, which will be on December 5th at the same time. Next time, we will focus on digital diplomacy and again look at new actors and the impact of technology in diplomacy. For the debate, we have Ambassador Stefano Baldi from the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ms. Liz Galvez, who is a former British diplomat, who will share their insights on digital diplomacy. So once again, thank you to our excellent presenters. It has been a pleasure spending this hour with you. And as always, we will follow up with the recording of the web debate and the summary of our discussion. But for now, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Katharina. I think this has been a very good experience, and I would be very happy if you want to see this as a first step through this web debate on humanitarian diplomacy, and do it again later as people think about how they would like to develop their own questions and preparation for this 25-year-away world.